For decades, one name has echoed through America's most powerful boardrooms, whispered in congressional hallways, and shouted on the protest lines: Charles Koch. To some, he's the mastermind of free market capitalism, the man who built a business empire worth tens of billions. To others, he's the shadowy kingmaker who rewired America's political landscape to fit his vision and perhaps his bottom line. From the polished headquarters of Koch Industries in Wichita, Kansas, Charles quietly built one of the largest privately held companies in the world. Oil, chemicals, pipelines, paper goods, if you've touched it, he's probably profited from it. But his real influence didn't stop at commerce. For years, a sprawling network of think tanks, advocacy groups, and political action committees fueled by Koch money has shaped legislation, guided elections, and redefined what's possible in American politics. Critics called it dark money, admirers called it strategic genius. Either way, Charles Koch was playing a game few even knew existed, and winning. His reach was so vast that journalists described his empire as a private political party operating outside the traditional system. But with great power comes great controversy. Leaked memos exposed aggressive campaigns against environmental regulations. Investigations alleged coordinated disinformation on climate change. Former allies accused Koch-backed groups of pushing the nation into deeper political divides. Then came the public backlash, boycotts, protests, and relentless media scrutiny. Even within the Republican Party, fractures emerged as Koch money clashed with Trump-era populism. And as the years passed, the empire he'd spent decades crafting faced new, unexpected threats, shifting public opinion, legal challenges, and the inescapable question of what happens when Charles, now well into his 82nd, can no longer pull the strings. He was once hailed as a brilliant industrialist, a philosopher CEO with a library full of Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises. Today, he's a polarizing figure whose legacy may be as much about politics as about business. Supporters argue he defended liberty against government overreach. Critics claim he undermined democracy itself. The man who rarely granted interviews suddenly found himself at the center of the national conversation, not for his business acumen, but for the enormous political machine he built in the shadows. They once stood at the very top, but what happened next? Join the Hidden Billionaires to uncover their story. Long before his name became synonymous with political influence and industrial power, Charles DeGannell Koch was just a boy growing up in the heartland of America, Wichita, Kansas. Born on the 1st of November, 1935, Charles was the second of four sons to Fred Chase Koch and Mary Robinson Koch. The Koch family was far from ordinary. Fred, an ambitious chemical engineer, had patented a revolutionary method for refining heavy crude oil, a process that would later seed the fortune Charles would inherit. Fred Koch wasn't just an engineer. He was a fiercely ideological man with deep suspicion of government intervention. His worldview, shaped by business battles and his controversial ties to foreign oil projects in Stalin-era Russia and Nazi Germany, left a lasting impression on young Charles. The Koch household was strict, competitive, and unapologetically capitalist. You had to earn your keep, Charles would later recall. Nothing was given for free. Mary Robinson Koch, a strong-willed and cultured woman, balanced the intensity of Fred's discipline with her own belief in education and refinement. She encouraged her children to read, debate, and pursue excellence. Still, childhood in the Koch home was not for the faint-hearted. Fred believed in hard work as a form of moral training. Summers for the Koch boys meant laboring in the hot Kansas sun, fixing fences, baling hay, and doing gritty jobs around the oil refineries. Charles later said, these early chores taught him two things: discipline and resilience. From an early age, Charles showed signs of a restless mind. While other children dreamed of baseball or cowboy adventures, Charles was captivated by mechanics, economics, and philosophy. He was the kind of child who would dismantle a toy to see how it worked, then spend hours thinking about how to improve it. His curiosity was relentless. His father, however, was not an easy man to please. Fred often warned his sons about the dangers of inherited wealth, insisting that money will ruin you if you don't learn to create it yourself. This was no empty threat. He famously cut off financial support to any of his boys who didn't meet his exacting standards. Charles attended the local private schools, where he excelled academically but was less socially outgoing than his brothers. He was a thinker, not a showman. Still, his academic performance earned him a spot at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, a decision that would shape his intellectual foundation for life. At MIT, Charles didn't just stop at one degree. He earned three: a bachelor's in general engineering, 1957, a master's in mechanical engineering, 1958, and another master's in chemical engineering, 1960. In Boston, far from Kansas, Charles absorbed not just technical knowledge but also the principles of Austrian economics and free market libertarianism. The works of Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises became his intellectual compass. But his post-MIT journey wasn't a straight line back to Koch Industries. Initially, Charles took a job at Arthur D. Little, a management consulting firm in Cambridge. His work was promising, and his career in corporate consulting looked secure. Yet Fred Koch had other plans. In 1961, with his health beginning to falter, Fred called Charles back to Wichita to help run the family business. At first reluctant, Charles eventually agreed, though he would later admit he never imagined he'd spend his life in Kansas. That decision would change not just his future, but the political and economic landscape of America. The young Charles Koch entered the oil business at a time when Koch Industries was modest compared to the juggernaut it would become. But his upbringing, equal parts intellectual rigor and hard-nosed capitalism, had already forged a man uniquely suited to grow an empire. He was disciplined, intensely private, and unwavering in his belief that free markets could solve almost any problem. Those roots, family discipline, philosophical conviction, and an MIT-trained mind would become the foundation for one of the most controversial and influential careers in modern American history. When Charles Koch returned to Wichita in 1961, Koch Industries was still a modest regional oil company, profitable, yes, but nowhere near the sprawling industrial empire it would become. The company had just a few hundred employees and annual revenues that, while respectable, paled in comparison to the multi-billion-dollar figures Charles would later command. At just 26 years old, Charles stepped into the role of vice president. The company was still under the watchful eye of Fred Koch, but Charles quickly began imprinting his own vision on its operations. His approach was methodical yet bold: diversify aggressively, innovate relentlessly, and never take the short-term view. He wasn't interested in simply being an oil refiner. He wanted to transform Koch Industries into a diversified powerhouse. By 1967, following the death of his father, Charles became president and CEO. This was no ceremonial title. The responsibility was absolute, and the pressure immense. With three brothers, Frederick, David, and William, all with their own ambitions, family dynamics quickly became part of the business chessboard. But Charles had both the education and the determination to lead. He immediately began implementing what he called market-based management, MBM, a corporate philosophy blending free market principles with organizational culture. MBM emphasized decentralization, entrepreneurial thinking at every level, and rewarding employees for measurable contributions to the company's profitability. In Charles's mind, this wasn't just management theory. It was a way to scale the company without suffocating innovation. Under his leadership, Koch Industries expanded far beyond oil refining. The company bought into fertilizers, chemicals, paper products, minerals, ranching, finance, and even commodities trading. The acquisitions were often shrewd and contrarian, buying assets others had overlooked or considered too risky. For Charles, it was about spotting inefficiencies and capitalizing before the competition even noticed. Throughout the 1972nd and 1982nd, Koch Industries grew at a staggering pace, with revenues increasing an average of 18% annually, a rate that far outstripped the U.S. economy. By the 1992nd, Koch had become one of the largest privately held companies in the world, a position it still holds today. But Charles's ambitions extended far beyond the boardroom. He began channeling millions of dollars into building an intellectual and political infrastructure that reflected his libertarian ideals. Think tanks like the Cato Institute, policy organizations such as Americans for Prosperity, and academic programs at universities became the nerve centers of a growing influence network. The Koch machine didn't just lobby politicians, it shaped the ideological terrain on which political battles were fought. This dual empire, one economic, one ideological, made Charles Koch a figure of both admiration and suspicion. Business journals praised his vision, his discipline, and his uncanny ability to avoid the public markets while still expanding aggressively. Political commentators, however, began warning of the disproportionate influence wielded by a single wealthy individual over democratic processes. By the 2002, Koch Industries' tentacles stretched across nearly every sector of the American economy. Charles's personal fortune soared into the tens of billions, regularly placing him on Forbes' list of the richest Americans. Yet, unlike flashier billionaires, Charles remained intensely private, rarely giving interviews and avoiding the public spotlight unless it was absolutely necessary. His rise to power was not without turbulence. Inside the family, bitter disputes erupted. In the 1982nd, William and Frederick accused Charles and David of cheating them out of their shares in Koch Industries. The resulting family feud led to one of the most expensive and drawn-out legal battles in American corporate history, lasting nearly 2 decades. Ultimately, Charles and David retained control, but the scars, personal and financial, were deep. Still, Charles pressed forward. His business success was undeniable, his political influence unmatched, and his wealth almost incomprehensible. By the 2010 second, he and David Koch had become known simply as the Koch brothers, shorthand for a political powerhouse whose money could shape elections, state policies, and national debates. In Charles's mind, he had climbed to the pinnacle not just of business, but of American influence itself. What began as a modest Kansas oil company had transformed into a global industrial titan, and at the same time, a political network so vast that it rivaled the major political parties in size and reach. It was the apex of power, but as history shows, the higher the climb, the steeper the potential fall. By the late 2002, Charles Koch had built not just a company, but a political infrastructure so sprawling that journalists began referring to it as the Kochtopus, a web of influence reaching into almost every corner of American politics. But with that power came a level of public scrutiny and controversy that even Charles, who had always preferred to work behind the scenes, could no longer avoid. The first storm gathered over environmental issues. Koch Industries was one of the largest privately held polluters in the United States, with critics citing pipeline leaks, toxic chemical spills, and air pollution violations. Environmental activists accused the company of not only harming the planet, but actively funding campaigns to discredit climate science. Reports revealed that Koch-funded think tanks had produced research questioning global warming, influencing lawmakers to stall environmental regulations. The backlash was fierce. Public protests, damning headlines, and even satirical late-night monologues targeting the once elusive billionaire. Then came political scandals. In the 2010 second, as the Tea Party movement surged, investigative journalists traced significant funding back to the Koch network. While Charles insisted the donations supported free market principles, opponents saw it as a direct attempt to reshape the political landscape in favor of corporate interests. The phrase dark money became a rallying cry for critics, pointing to the lack of transparency in how the Koch empire funneled millions into advocacy groups without disclosing donors. The personal toll was mounting. Charles, now a household name in political controversy, became a polarizing figure. Supporters hailed him as a defender of liberty and small government. Detractors called him a threat to democracy itself. His inbox and phone lines were flooded with both praise and hate. Security around his family had to be tightened. For a man who valued privacy above all else, This level of exposure was suffocating. Adding to the strain was the deepening family rift. The decades-long legal battles with his brothers William and Frederick had left wounds that never fully healed. Courtroom testimony and leaked depositions painted a picture of betrayal, manipulation, and fierce rivalry. The lawsuits were settled, but the bitterness lingered, permanently fracturing the family that had once built the empire together. Even within his political network, cracks began to show. The rise of Donald Trump created a schism. Charles's libertarian ideals, especially his advocacy for free trade and limited government spending, often clashed with Trump's populist protectionist policies. Some Republican leaders who had once courted Koch money now distanced themselves, wary of alienating Trump's voter base. Meanwhile, progressive movements grew louder, targeting Koch-backed legislation and corporate influence in politics. Legal pressures added another layer of risk. Koch Industries faced numerous lawsuits over environmental damage, workplace safety violations, and alleged price manipulation in energy markets. While the company settled many of these cases without admitting wrongdoing, the sheer volume of legal actions fueled public suspicion. Headlines about multi-million-dollar fines became part of the Koch narrative. For Charles, the price of fame was more than just bad press. It was the slow erosion of the controlled, behind-the-scenes influence he had spent decades perfecting. The more the public learned about his methods, the harder it became to operate in secrecy. The Koch name had become so politically charged that it could spark protests simply by appearing on a donor list. And then came the most personal blow of all. In 2019, David Koch, Charles's younger brother and closest ally in both business and politics, passed away after a long battle with prostate cancer. David's death left Charles as the sole patriarch of the Koch empire, a lonely position at a time when both his political influence and the public's perception of him were under siege. The man who had once controlled an empire from the shadows was now fully exposed to the light, and it was not always flattering. The passing of David Koch in 2019 marked a poignant turning point for Charles Koch, not just personally, but for the sprawling empire they had built together. Suddenly, Charles found himself steering the vast Koch Industries and the influential political machine alone, in an era that had become far less forgiving to secretive billionaires. After decades of relentless expansion and quiet maneuvering behind the scenes, Charles began to recalibrate. His once impenetrable fortress of privacy was now under constant public scrutiny. Yet, unlike many in his position who might retreat entirely, Charles adopted a strategy of cautious adaptation. Koch Industries, under his leadership, quietly but steadily expanded into new sectors: renewable energy, agriculture technology, and sustainable materials, reflecting a subtle acknowledgement of shifting market realities and public expectations. This pivot was never loudly announced, but industry insiders noticed a change. The company that once embodied the fossil fuel age was tentatively stepping into the future. Politically, Charles's approach shifted as well. The Koch network, which had once aggressively funded libertarian and conservative causes, began to diversify its support, even quietly backing some centrist candidates to counterbalance the polarizing waves of populism that had surged in recent years. This pragmatic shift reflected Charles's realization that maintaining influence required flexibility in a fragmented political landscape. Away from business and politics, Charles embraced philanthropy more visibly. While still private about many personal details, he and his late brother's foundations poured millions into education, medical research, and cultural institutions. Yet, even in philanthropy, his approach remained grounded in his core beliefs, supporting initiatives that promoted innovation, personal responsibility, and free enterprise. Socially, Charles's life became more low-key. He continued to avoid the media spotlight, rarely granting interviews, but allowed more glimpses into his personal philosophies through essays and talks delivered at select academic forums. These rare appearances revealed a man deeply committed to his principles, yet keenly aware of the complexities and contradictions his legacy now entailed. However, the challenges persisted. Public protests against Koch Industries' environmental track record didn't cease, and critics continued to question the influence of dark money in politics. Some of Charles's former allies distanced themselves, wary of the negative associations tied to the Koch name. Meanwhile, the rise of social media amplified voices that once might have been confined to niche activist groups. Despite this, Charles maintained his conviction that free markets and limited government remain the best engines of progress. He believed the storm of criticism was partly fueled by misunderstanding and fear of concentrated wealth and power, but also, in part, an inevitable reaction to change itself. In the quieter moments, Charles reportedly reflected on the paradox of his life. The son of a stern father who warned him against the perils of inherited wealth, had himself built one of the largest fortunes in history, yet had paid a price in personal relationships, public perception, and the loss of privacy. Today, Charles Koch lives as a figure both revered and reviled, a titan who reshaped American industry and politics, but whose methods sparked fierce debate. Whether operating from his Wichita home or quietly advising the next generation, he remains a man shaped by his convictions, grappling with the legacy of a lifetime spent in the shadows and the spotlight alike. As Charles Koch advanced in age, the question of succession and legacy became increasingly central, not just for Koch Industries, but for the entire political and philanthropic network he helped create. The Koch family's story, marked by both towering successes and bitter rifts, remains as complicated as ever. Charles has been married twice and fathered 3 children. His private nature extends to his family life, keeping his children largely shielded from the public eye. Despite this, the Koch children have been groomed carefully for roles within the company and associated ventures, each encouraged to embody the same values of hard work, entrepreneurship, and libertarian philosophy instilled by their father and grandfather. The eldest son, Chase Koch, has taken on a significant leadership role within Koch Industries. Over recent years, Chase has championed efforts to modernize the company, pushing for technological innovation, sustainability initiatives, and diversification beyond traditional energy sectors. This has been seen as a strategic move to position the company for the future while honoring the free market principles foundational to the Koch legacy. Meanwhile, Charles's other children have pursued varied paths, some focused more on philanthropy and cultural initiatives connected to the family foundations. Across these endeavors, there is a clear thread, a commitment to shaping society through education, entrepreneurship, and civic engagement rather than politics alone. However, the scars of earlier family conflicts still cast a long shadow. The legal battles that once divided Charles from his brothers remain a cautionary tale within the family. Yet, Charles has reportedly sought to prevent similar disputes in this generation, emphasizing transparency, clear governance, and shared values. Beyond the family, the Koch empire's political and philanthropic arms have grown more institutionalized. The sprawling network of organizations, including Americans for Prosperity, the Mercatus Center, and the Cato Institute, now operate with their own leadership and increasingly diverse funding sources. This evolution ensures the continuation of Koch principles, even as direct family involvement may evolve. Publicly, the Koch family has also sought to soften their image. High-profile donations to medical research, education, and the arts have helped broaden their reputation beyond politics and oil. For instance, significant gifts to cancer research institutions have been highlighted, especially after David Koch's own battle with the disease. Yet, the Koch name still ignites controversy. Some activists and political opponents argue the family's wealth continues to wield outsized influence on public policy and democracy. Supporters counter that their advocacy promotes economic freedom and individual responsibility. As Charles contemplates his own mortality, he is reported to be focused on ensuring the family's continued role as stewards of the empire and its ideals. This includes preparing future leaders not only to manage assets, but to defend the vision of limited government and free enterprise that has defined the Koch legacy for nearly a century. In the end, Charles Koch's legacy will be measured not just in billions or businesses, but in how his family and institutions navigate the turbulent waters of modern America, whether they maintain their influence, evolve with the times, or become a cautionary example of concentrated wealth and power. Charles Koch's life and career have left an indelible mark on both American industry and politics, a legacy that continues to spark debate and shape the country's future. Few billionaires have wielded as much influence outside the public eye, quietly reshaping markets, policies, and ideologies through a vast, interconnected network. In business, Koch revolutionized how a private company could grow, building Koch Industries into a global titan spanning oil, chemicals, consumer goods, and beyond, all while remaining privately held. This model challenged the conventional wisdom that massive scale required public ownership. His market-based management system is studied in business schools and adopted by companies worldwide, praised for fostering decentralized innovation and long-term thinking. Politically, Charles's legacy is more polarizing but no less profound. His extensive funding of think tanks, advocacy groups, and political campaigns created a new blueprint for corporate political engagement. Through organizations like Americans for Prosperity, Koch introduced grassroots lobbying, targeted voter outreach, and strategic messaging that helped shift the Republican Party and broader conservative movement toward libertarian principles. Yet, this influence also raised urgent questions about the role of money in democracy. Critics argue that the Koch network's use of dark money and extensive lobbying contributed to political polarization, climate change denial, and policies favoring corporate interests over public welfare. These debates continue to shape campaign finance reform discussions and the public's trust in political institutions. In academia, Koch's philanthropy funded research centers, scholarships, and university programs promoting free market economics, creating lasting educational legacies. These initiatives continue to influence generations of economists, policymakers, and entrepreneurs aligned with his vision. His personal philosophy, steeped in the works of Ayn Rand and Austrian economists, championed individual liberty, personal responsibility, and minimal government intervention. While fiercely criticized by some as ideological dogma, others see it as a steadfast defense of economic freedom in an increasingly complex world. On the global stage, Koch's impact resonates in the energy sector's evolution and debates over sustainability. The company's gradual moves into renewable energy and sustainable practices reflect a legacy adapting to new realities, even as the shadow of past environmental controversies lingers. Experts and historians remain divided in their assessments. Some hail Charles Koch as a visionary who reshaped American capitalism and safeguarded liberty. Others warn his legacy embodies the dangers of unchecked wealth influencing politics and society. Regardless, his story offers valuable lessons on ambition, power, influence, and the costs that accompany them. It challenges followers and critics alike to grapple with the complicated intersections of business success, political activism, and personal conviction. Decades from now, Koch's name will still evoke strong reactions: admiration, anger, respect, or distrust. But one thing is clear: he has etched his place in history as one of the most consequential figures in modern American business and politics. Charles Koch's journey is a portrait of ambition, vision, and controversy wrapped into one of America's most powerful hidden legacies. From a disciplined Kansas upbringing to the helm of a multi-industry empire, his life is a testament to relentless pursuit and conviction. He was a man who reshaped not only markets, but the very political and ideological frameworks that govern a nation. His influence stretched far beyond the boardroom into think tanks, election campaigns, and public discourse. Yet, with all that power came deep personal and public costs, fractured family ties, public backlash, and a legacy questioned by millions. Charles Koch's story teaches us that extreme ambition and unwavering principles can build empires, but they can also spark division and controversy. The price of influence is high, and the lines between business, politics, and ethics often blur. Whether you see him as a defender of liberty or a symbol of corporate overreach, Charles Koch's life challenges us to consider the power of wealth in shaping society and the responsibility that comes with it. They once stood at the very top, but what happened next? Join the Hidden Billionaires to uncover their story.